my God.
She thought she knew her husband. She thought she knew her neighbor. But most of all, she thought she knew what love looked like when it was real. She was wrong about all of it. For 12 years, her husband came home to her every week, kissed her on the cheek, asked about her day, and slept in her bed. And then, 3 nights a week, he walked 30 feet across a shared driveway and did the exact same thing for another woman. 2 wives, 1 street, 1 fence between them, and not a single person on that block had any idea. But here is the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. The moment the truth finally came out, it did not come from a detective. It did not come from a phone record or a credit card statement or a late-night confession. It came from a child's red hoodie sitting in a front yard on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. And when Claire Henderson saw it, she stood at her mailbox, counted 60 seconds in her head, walked back inside, and made 2 phone calls that would end 2 marriages, open a criminal investigation, and uncover a secret that had been hiding in plain sight for longer than either woman had been on that street. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. We love hearing from this community, and if you have not subscribed yet, please do that right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let us go back to the beginning, because to understand how something like this is even possible, you have to understand the street, the man, and the 2 women who trusted him with everything they had. Maple Creek Drive is the kind of street that exists in every mid-sized American city and that most people who did not grow up on a street like it tend to imagine when they think of the word neighborhood in its most uncomplicated form. It sits on the eastern edge of Westerville, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus that describes itself as a community and means it in the way that smaller American towns mean it, with school fundraisers and block association emails, and a Facebook group where people post about lost dogs and suspicious vehicles and the best place locally to get your gutters cleaned. The houses are well maintained without being showy. The lawns are mostly even. There are American flags on some of the porches and basketball hoops in some of the driveways, and the kind of general, low-hum ordinariness that makes a place feel safe not because anything dramatic has ever been done to make it safe, but simply because nothing dramatic has ever happened there to suggest otherwise. This is the street where Claire Henderson moved in October of 2011 with her new husband David and a golden retriever named Cooper and a set of secondhand bookshelves that took the better part of a Saturday to assemble. This is the street where, 2 years later, a moving truck pulled up next door and a woman named Marie stepped out with a baby on her hip and a warm smile, and a husband who was, though neither woman on that street would know it for another 9 years, the same man. Claire Henderson grew up in Dayton, the second of 3 children in a household that her friends describe as warm, bookish, and productively chaotic. Her father taught high school history. Her mother worked part-time as a copy editor and spent the rest of her time reading, which meant the Henderson house was at any given moment somewhere between a library and a comfortable mess of paperback spines and sticky notes and half-finished cups of tea going cold on every flat surface. Claire absorbed all of it. By the time she was 12, she was reading books her teachers had not assigned and asking questions in class that required her teachers to look things up before the next session. She was not a show-off about it. She was simply curious in the way that some people are simply tall, organically, as a fact of her nature rather than a choice. Her teachers remembered her as patient, precise, and unusually observant, the kind of student who would notice if you moved the globe to the other side of the classroom over the weekend. She went to Ohio State on a partial academic scholarship, studied library science, and graduated in 2004 with the clear and uncomplicated intention of spending her professional life in a place surrounded by organized information and the people who came looking for it. By her late 20s, she was a school librarian in a suburb of Columbus, a job she loved not because it was prestigious or well-compensated, but because it suited her the way a well-fitted coat suits a person, completely, without friction, without the daily low-grade discomfort of work that does not match who you are. She was good at it. She was good at finding things. She was good at knowing where to look. She would spend the next 12 years of her life learning, in the most painful way possible, the precise limits of that skill. She met David Mercer at a mutual friend's backyard birthday party on a Saturday evening in July of 2009. He was tall, easy with a smile, the kind of man who listened when you talked rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He noticed her about 20 minutes into the party, crossed the yard, introduced himself, and asked not what she did for work, but what she was reading. She told him she was in the middle of a biography of Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who designed Central Park, and he said he found it interesting how much of the way a city felt had been decided by a single person's vision, and whether that was a kind of power that most people never thought about. She talked to him for 2 hours. She told her sister the following morning that she had never felt so completely attended to by someone she had just met, that he had a quality of presence she had not encountered before in quite that form, an ability to make you feel like you were the only person in the room worth talking to. She would learn, years later, that this quality was genuine. She would also learn that she had not been the only person it was used on. They dated for 14 months. He brought her coffee exactly the way she had mentioned once, in passing, that she liked it. He met her parents in December of 2009, and her father, who was not an easy man to impress, told Claire afterward that he liked him, that David seemed like a man who meant what he said. He proposed in February of 2011, not in a restaurant with an audience, but in her apartment on a Thursday evening with a ring that was exactly what she would have chosen for herself. That required either extraordinary luck or extraordinary attention, and nobody who knew David Mercer believed for a moment that it was luck. They married in April of 2011. 72 guests, a string quartet, a reception in her parents' backyard in Dayton. Her mother told a friend later that David cried during the vows, not the performed kind of crying that a man produces because he thinks he is supposed to, but the quiet, genuine kind that arrives without warning and that the person experiencing it clearly wishes were slightly more private. They bought the house on Maple Creek Drive that October, moved in over a long weekend, and Claire planted tomatoes in the cedar raised bed that David built for her one Saturday in the spring because she had mentioned exactly once, in passing, that she had always wanted one. This is the detail that people pause on when they hear the full story. The raised bed, the fact that he remembered, the fact that he built it with his own hands on a Saturday morning because she wanted it. Because it is simply a kind thing to do for a person you love, and David Mercer did it. And the tomatoes grew, and none of that stops being true just because everything else was a lie. There is one other detail from those early years that Claire would return to again and again once she understood what she was looking at. It seemed so unremarkable at the time that she would have been embarrassed to call it a concern. David always parked in the garage. Always, not most of the time, not when the weather was bad, always. Even when the garage was so full of holiday storage and yard equipment and accumulated household material that fitting the car inside required moving things around, David moved them. He backed in carefully, closed the door, came inside. Claire asked him about it once, maybe 2 years into the marriage, the way you ask a person about a small habit you have noticed without attaching any weight to it. He said it was something his father had always done, that he liked keeping the car out of the weather and the sun, that he found something satisfying about a closed garage at the end of the day. She believed him completely. It made perfect sense. She did not think about it again for years. Not until the day a private investigator sat across from her at a kitchen table and explained, with a diagram and a calendar, that the garage was not a habit. The garage was the most important structural element of the entire system David had built, and without it, the whole thing would have collapsed years earlier. David Mercer grew up in Cincinnati, the only child of parents who divorced when he was 7 and spent the following decade using him, in the way that divorcing parents sometimes do without fully intending to, as a dispatch channel for their resentment of each other. He moved between households on a schedule that was never stable, spent summers with one parent and school years with the other until the arrangement broke down, and he ended up primarily with his mother, who remarried twice before David left for college. People who knew him in those years describe a child who was quiet, self-contained, and extraordinarily good at reading a room, at knowing what a given adult needed to hear and providing it without appearing to calculate the delivery. A school counselor noted in a record obtained during the later legal proceedings that David demonstrated an unusual emotional intelligence for a boy his age, though she also observed that it functioned primarily as a protective mechanism rather than a connective one, that he was gifted at making people feel understood without revealing very much of himself in return. He graduated from Ohio University with a business degree, took a job in insurance sales in Columbus in 2000, and built a career that was steady and unremarkable, and that kept him moving between cities and clients and territory in a way that would, within a few years, proved to be structurally essential to what he was quietly constructing on the side. Marie Wilson grew up in Chillicothe, about 50 miles south of Columbus, the older of two daughters in a close, practical family. Her father ran a small plumbing supply company. Her mother was a school nurse for 30 years. Marie was, by every account, warm and direct, a woman who said what she meant, followed through on what she committed to, and had a quality of loyalty that her friends describe as both her greatest strength and, in the context of what was about to happen to her, her most consequential vulnerability. She worked as a dental hygienist. She met David in the spring of 2011 through a mutual professional acquaintance at a Columbus networking event. It is worth pausing on that timeline, because the spring of 2011 is the same season in which David was finalizing his marriage to Claire. He was meeting Marie while he was marrying Claire. He was building the second foundation before the first one had fully cured. They dated for about a year. He proposed in the summer of 2012. They married that September in a small ceremony in Chillicothe. In 2013, when their daughter Lily was born, they moved to Westerville, to a house on Maple Creek Drive, directly next door to Claire and David. And Marie stood in her doorway on moving day with a baby on her hip and a warm and slightly tired smile. And Claire came over the following afternoon with a chicken casserole, and they stood together in the doorway and talked for 15 minutes and discovered that their husbands were both in insurance sales, and they laughed about what a small world it was. Claire went home and told David over dinner. David said that was a coincidence and asked if she wanted more pasta. The conversation moved on. For 2 years, it stayed exactly that innocent. To understand what David was actually doing between those two houses, you have to set aside every instinct you have developed from other stories about men who led double lives, because almost all of those instincts are wrong when applied to this case. You are probably picturing someone nervous, someone who flinched when a phone rang in the wrong room, who told bad lies under pressure, who left a trail of small inconsistencies that should have been visible long before anyone went looking. That is not this story. David Mercer was not a nervous man. He was not improvising. What he had built on Maple Creek Drive was not a reckless entanglement that expanded beyond its original intention. It was a system, deliberate, architecturally precise, and continuously maintained, that had been running without a detectable failure for nearly a decade before the first crack appeared. And the reason it worked was not primarily because the system was clever, though it was. It worked because it was built entirely on the one material that neither woman would ever have thought to test. It was built on their trust. The mechanics were later documented in full during the legal proceedings, and they are, in their own terrible way, a study in logistical precision. David maintained 2 separate cell phones, each in a distinct compartment of his work bag, each with its own contacts, its own voicemail, its own photographs, its own version of his life. He structured his insurance sales schedule, which was genuinely flexible by the nature of the work, so that he spent alternating blocks of days in 2 different parts of his territory, each block assigned to one household. Claire received him Monday through Thursday in most weeks. Marie received him Thursday evening through Sunday, with the Thursday overlap managed through the cover story of late client meetings and early morning departures that both women had long accepted as simply the nature of his job. He maintained a post office box in a part of Columbus that neither woman had reason to visit, which received any financial or legal correspondence that could not go to either home address. He kept 2 separate checking accounts at 2 different banks, 2 life insurance policies, each naming a different woman as sole beneficiary, 2 sets of medical providers, 2 social circles with no crossover between them, 2 churches, 2 complete and non-overlapping versions of his domestic life running simultaneously on the same street, in the same suburb of the same city in central Ohio. And at both houses, without exception, he parked in the garage so that his car was never visible from the street, which meant it was never visible from either driveway, which meant there was never a silver 4-door with a dented rear panel sitting next door to prompt a question that neither woman was yet asking. The cognitive weight of maintaining this, of keeping 2 narratives internally consistent across years of daily life, of never allowing a name or a reference or a detail from one house to surface in conversation at the other, is something that forensic psychologists who later examined the case described as exceeding what most human beings can sustain without collapse. David Mercer sustained it for 9 years on Maple Creek Drive, and for years before that. He sustained it because, as best as anyone who has studied this case can determine, he had been running some version of this system since his early 20s, and the habits of it were, by the time he moved to Westerville, as automatic as breathing. He did not experience what he was doing as a daily performance of extraordinary discipline. He experienced it as simply the way his life worked, which is perhaps the most unsettling thing anyone has said about this case, and several people have said it. Claire noticed the first anomaly on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2021. She had left work early because a water main near the school had burst and classes were dismissed just after noon. She drove home the same route she always took, made the same turn onto Maple Creek Drive she had made thousands of times, and slowed at the sight of a car in Marie's driveway that she recognized immediately. It was David's car. Not a car similar to David's. His specific car, the silver four-door with the small dent on the rear passenger panel from a parking garage incident 2 years earlier, sitting in Marie's driveway in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon at a time when David had told her he had back-to-back client meetings in Cincinnati. She sat at the end of the street for 4 minutes. She went through every innocent explanation she could construct, every alternative reading of what she was seeing, every scenario in which that car in that driveway meant something other than what it appeared to mean. She built several. None of them fully held. After 4 minutes, she drove past, parked in her own driveway, went inside, and said nothing. That evening, she asked David how Cincinnati had gone. Long day, he said. Lot of traffic coming back. He poured himself a glass of water and asked what was for dinner. She told him. She passed him the salt. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark for a long time thinking about 4 minutes and a silver car and a dent on a rear passenger panel that she wished, more than she had ever wished anything, that she had never learned to recognize. Over the following weeks, Claire began keeping a journal. Not the reflective kind she had kept since college. This was a record. Dates, times, observations. She noted the days she saw his car in Marie's driveway, which happened 3 more times over the following 6 weeks. She noted evenings he came home later than his stated schedule required. She noted small geographical misalignments between his claimed locations and what she had quietly, incidentally observed. She was not panicking. She was not confronting. She was gathering, methodically and without drama, in the way a woman who has spent her professional life cross-referencing information gathers things when she suspects something is not filed where it should be. She was building a case without calling it that yet, because calling it that would have required naming a possibility she was not fully prepared to live inside of. She searched his car once, on a morning in late April when he was in the shower, and she told herself she was retrieving something she had left in the back seat. She looked through the familiar work bag on the passenger seat and found nothing unusual. Insurance documents, a client folder, a charger, a protein bar. She stood in the garage for a moment and registered that there was a second bag, smaller, pushed under the passenger seat against the center console, that she had either never noticed before or never paid attention to before, and she could not now distinguish between those two possibilities. She did not open it. She was not ready. She needed not just confirmation of what was happening, but the full scale of how long it had been happening, and for that she needed someone whose capacity for documentation exceeded her own. She closed the car door, walked back inside, finished her coffee, taught a full day of school, and thought about that second bag for 6 weeks before she made the call. The moment that ended any remaining uncertainty came on a Thursday afternoon in October of 2022. Claire came home from work at her usual time and saw Marie's daughter Lily playing in the front yard next door. Lily was 9 years old at this point, and Claire had watched her grow from the baby on Marie's hip at the moving truck through every age since with the fond, neighborly attention that people pay to children who live close. What was not usual was what Lily was wearing. She had on a small red zip-up hoodie with the Columbus Blue Jackets logo on the chest, a particular shade of red-orange, a particular font, a particular white stripe on the collar. Claire recognized it because she had purchased it 3 months earlier at the team store at Nationwide Arena, because David had asked her to pick up a hockey hoodie for the child of one of his clients, a family with a young daughter who loved the Blue Jackets. She had bought it, wrapped it in tissue paper, handed it to David on a Wednesday morning when he left for what he said was a long week of client visits in the southern part of his territory. He thanked her. He said the kid was going to love it. The kid was Lily. Lily was wearing it in the front yard 30 feet away. Claire stood at her mailbox and looked at that hoodie for 60 seconds, counting deliberately, giving herself time to make sure she was not going to do something she could not take back. Then she walked inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and called her sister. The following morning, she called Sandra Voss. Sandra Voss had been a licensed private investigator in Columbus for 16 years. Before that, she had spent 8 years as a senior paralegal at a family law firm that handled some of the most complex marital and asset concealment cases in Franklin County, which meant that by the time she opened her own practice, she had seen the documentary anatomy of domestic deception from angles that most investigators simply had not. She charged a flat daily rate, drove an unremarkable gray sedan, kept meticulous notes in a system she had refined over years of fieldwork, and had one professional rule that was absolute and non-negotiable, which was that she never shared conclusions with a client until she was certain. Not when the picture was beginning to form. Not when the evidence was suggestive. When she was certain. She told Claire all of this in their first phone call. She also told her that whatever she found, she would tell her clearly and directly, without softening, because the worst thing she could do for a client was allow them to continue living inside uncertainty a moment longer than the evidence required. Claire told her everything she had. Sandra listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, Sandra said she would be in touch within a week, and she was in touch within 48 hours, because what she found in the first 2 days shifted the shape of the case so completely that waiting the full week felt wrong. The background check Sandra ran on David Mercer in the first 24 hours returned 2 active mortgage accounts registered in his name at 2 different Ohio addresses. Both addresses were on Maple Creek Drive in Westerville. Same street, 2 different house numbers. Sandra sat with that result for a long time before she moved forward, because in 16 years she had seen a great many things, but she had not seen this particular configuration before, and she wanted to be sure she was reading it correctly before she drew any conclusions. She was reading it correctly. She pulled financial records over the following 24 hours, which produced results that she described to Claire later, in the measured and deliberate tone that people adopt when they are delivering information they know will change someone's life, in 2 careful stages. The first stage was the bank accounts. David maintained 2 separate checking accounts at 2 different financial institutions, each with its own mailing address, each funded through his insurance commission income divided by a methodology that Sandra's forensic accountant colleague later described as surprisingly sophisticated for someone managing it alone. The second stage was the life insurance policies. David Mercer carried 2 active life insurance policies, each named a different woman as sole beneficiary. One named Claire Henderson Mercer, one named Marie Wilson Mercer. Both policies had been active for years. Both premiums had been paid without a single lapse. And then Sandra found the marriage certificate. Marie Wilson and David Mercer, married in Franklin County, Ohio, in September of 2012, 17 months after David had married Claire. Both marriages were legal. Both were on record. Both were entirely legitimate documents filed with the state of Ohio by the same man with the same social security number and the same date of birth, separated by less than 2 years and by 30 feet of shared fence on a cul-de-sac in Westerville. Sandra sat with that document for a long time before she called Claire. She said later that in 16 years of this work she had encountered a great deal, but she had never quite sat with something like that. She called Claire on a Thursday afternoon and told her calmly and directly what she had found, leaving nothing out and adding nothing that was not documented. Claire was silent for 1 minute and 50 seconds. Sandra counted, because counting was what she did when she did not know what else to do. Then Claire said, very quietly, that she needed to meet her. She meant Marie. Before that meeting could happen, the investigation hit a wall. In the last week of October 2022, David switched almost entirely to cash. No grocery charges. No gas station receipts. No restaurant transactions. Nothing that could be time-stamped and mapped to a specific location at a specific time. Sandra had seen this pattern before, not frequently, but enough times to understand exactly what it meant. It meant he was aware, or at minimum suspicious, that the perimeter of his life had been breached somewhere he had not yet identified. It meant he had tightened. She told Claire that they needed to move carefully, that pressing too hard too fast could give him enough warning to take action, whether that meant moving assets, disappearing from one of the households, or simply becoming so guarded that the confrontation, when it finally came, produced nothing on record. For 10 days they waited. For 10 days, David Mercer went about his life on Maple Creek Drive with what appeared to all the world to be complete normality. He mowed the lawn. He came home when he said he would. He made dinner. He watched the game on Sunday. And Sandra Voss sat in a parked car down the street and documented every visible movement and wondered, the way she always wondered in the waiting phase of a case like this, what it felt like to be inside a life like his and to know, at some cellular level, that something was coming and to go on performing ordinariness anyway because there was nothing else to do. The break came from a direction nobody had anticipated, and it came not because of anything Sandra did or anything Claire planned, but because David Mercer, for the first time in 9 years of operational precision, made a mistake so simple and so complete that it required no interpretation at all. In the first week of November 2022, David was managing the logistics of 2 birthday celebrations falling within 6 days of each other. Claire's birthday was November 9th. Marie's was November 14th. For 9 years, he had managed this without incident, which is a fact that speaks to either an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization or a quality of emotional detachment from the moral weight of what he was doing that is, in its own way, as disturbing as any other element of this story. But in that first week of November 2022, under some combination of stress and distraction that no one has ever been fully able to explain, he sent an email meant for Marie, containing a flight confirmation to Charleston, South Carolina, a dinner reservation at a waterfront restaurant, and the opening words, "My love," to the email address claire.henderson.mercer@gmail.com. He recognized the error within 4 minutes and sent a second email to Claire's address saying that message was not meant for you. Claire read the second email first, while she was standing in the kitchen making tea, and she stood there holding her phone for a long moment before she opened the one that had arrived 4 minutes earlier and read the flight confirmation and the dinner reservation and the words "My love" at the top of a message addressed to a woman whose name she now knew, for the first time, was Marie. Claire printed both emails. She placed them in a folder alongside 9 months of journal entries, the financial records Sandra had provided, the surveillance photographs from the weeks of observation, and a certified copy of Marie's marriage certificate. She labeled the folder with the date, the way a librarian labels things, and she walked to the back of her yard, to the wooden fence that had stood between the 2 properties for as long as she had lived on that street, and she knocked on it. Marie opened the gate about 30 seconds later, wearing gardening gloves and carrying a trowel, looking mildly surprised in the specific way that neighbors look when someone appears at their back gate unannounced on a weekday afternoon. Claire looked at her for a moment and said, "I think we need to have a conversation. My name is Claire. I live next door. I am David's wife." Marie did not speak for what felt, by Claire's account, like a very long time. Then she stepped back, opened the gate all the way, and said, "Come inside." What happened in Marie's kitchen over the next 4 hours is something that neither woman has ever described publicly in complete detail, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be, because some reckonings belong only to the people who live them. What is known, because both women confirmed it in separate legal contexts, is that they spent those 4 hours comparing documents, comparing timelines, comparing the architecture of the lives they had been living in parallel houses on the same street, and discovering with a thoroughness that was almost clinical how completely and consistently David had replicated one relationship inside the other. The same stories about his childhood in Cincinnati, the same explanations for his travel schedule, the same professed fears and professed dreams, the same anniversary date, shifted by exactly 1 week between the 2 households. Marie said later that at some point during those 4 hours, she stopped feeling anything directed at Claire and started feeling something that did not have a clean name. The specific and devastating recognition that she and this woman who had been her neighbor for 9 years were, in some profound and terrible way, the same person. That they had been living parallel versions of the same life, separated by a wooden fence and a man who had been performing the same role with the same script in 2 different houses for the entirety of both of their adult lives on that street. Claire and Marie agreed, before they left that kitchen, on 3 things. They would not contact David separately. They would give him no indication that anything had changed until they were ready. And when the conversation happened, it would happen on their terms, in a place they chose, at a time they controlled. And there would be a recording of every word, because both women understood by then that they were dealing with a man who had demonstrated a remarkable capacity for constructing narratives that suited his purposes. And neither of them was willing to be in a position afterward where the only documented version of the confrontation was his. They chose a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks later. Claire's living room. Marie came through the back gate, and they sat down together, and they waited. David came home at 2:30, the way he always did on Sundays, parked in the garage, walked in through the side door, set his bag down on the kitchen counter, and looked up. He saw both of them. He stood completely still for a moment that Claire would later describe as the longest pause she had ever experienced in her life, longer even than the 60 seconds at the mailbox, longer even than the minute and 50 seconds on the phone with Sandra. And then he said, "I can explain." And Claire said, very quietly, "We have already explained it to each other." What followed was not a screaming match. It was not a dramatic breakdown. It was something much harder to watch and much harder to describe, which is probably why it stayed with Sandra Voss, who was listening from the hallway with a digital recorder, for years afterward. David did not shout. He did not deny. He did not attempt to construct an alternative version of events or reframe what was in the folder Claire placed on the coffee table in front of him. He looked at Marie's marriage certificate for a long time. He confirmed the timeline. He confirmed the schedule. He confirmed the 2 phones, the 2 bank accounts, the 2 insurance policies, the garage, all of it, clearly and completely, and without qualification. And then he said there was something else they both needed to know. Something he had not told either of them. Something that had been driving much of what they did not yet understand about the last 3 years specifically. In November of 2019, David Mercer had been diagnosed with a progressive heart condition. The diagnosis was serious enough that his cardiologist had given him a prognosis measured not in decades, but in years. He had told no one. Not Claire, not Marie, not a single person in either of his lives. He had attended appointments alone, filled prescriptions at a pharmacy in a part of Columbus that neither woman had reason to visit, and continued living both of his lives as though the diagnosis had not happened, becoming, if anything, more attentive and more present in both households in the years after 2019 than he had been before. Claire asked him why. She asked why he had not told her, why he had not told Marie, why he had carried a terminal diagnosis for 3 years in silence while accelerating a deception that was already beyond any ordinary understanding. He said, "Because I was afraid that if either of you knew I was dying, you would leave. And I could not face the end of either of these lives without the person in it." Claire told a friend afterward that she sat with that answer for a long time, and that what she felt was not sympathy, but it was not pure anger either. It was something closer to grief, she said, not only for her marriage and not only for the years that were gone, but for whatever had been so broken inside him for so long that this had seemed, to him, like the only possible way to live. The legal proceedings that followed were relatively brief, given the volume of what had been done. Bigamy in Ohio is a 4th-degree felony carrying a potential sentence of up to 18 months in prison. David entered an immediate and complete guilty plea. He was sentenced to a suspended term with 2 years of probation and mandatory counseling, a sentence that reflected his medical condition, his full cooperation, and the fact that neither woman was seeking incarceration. What they were seeking, and what they received, was a complete financial accounting, the dissolution of both marriages, and equitable division of David's assets between the 2 households. The case was reported locally first, picked up by a Columbus television station in the spring of 2023 under the headline "Ohio Man maintained 2 legal marriages on same street for nearly a decade," and migrated to national outlets within 48 hours. It was dissected in podcasts and law school classrooms and marriage counseling offices. It became, briefly, one of those stories that a culture uses to examine itself, the way stories occasionally do when they are ordinary enough and extraordinary enough at the same time to feel like a test of how much we actually know about the people living closest to us. The question that came up everywhere, in every format, was always the same. How did no one see it? The experts who commented on the case were largely in agreement on one point. The reason it lasted as long as it did had almost nothing to do with how clever the system was. It had almost everything to do with the fact that both women were deeply trusting people who had no framework for the possibility that what they were being asked to trust was not real, and that the man asking them to trust it had been practicing the ask for a very long time. 6 months after David's sentencing, Claire received a handwritten letter at her new address in Asheville, North Carolina, where she had relocated shortly after the divorce was finalized. It was 3 pages, written in careful and deliberate handwriting on plain white paper. It was from a woman named Angela Reeves. Angela wrote that she had followed the story when it broke in the Columbus media, that she had spent several weeks deciding whether to reach out, and that she had finally decided she had to, because there was something Claire deserved to know. Angela had been married to David Mercer. Not recently. Between 2003 and 2009. Before Claire, before Marie, before Maple Creek Drive, before any of it. She had met him in Cincinnati, where she worked as a physical therapist. She had married him at 28 and spent 6 years believing she was in a difficult but workable marriage to a traveling salesman who loved her but struggled with the kind of sustained emotional openness that long relationships require. They had separated in 2009. She had assumed, for 14 years, that it had simply been a failed marriage, the kind that ends not in drama but in a slow and mutual recognition that the two people inside it have stopped being able to reach each other. She had rebuilt her life. She had moved on. She had never suspected that what she had actually been part of was not a failed marriage, but a rehearsal. Angela's letter changed the shape of the story in a way that the initial reporting had not managed to accomplish, because it pushed the beginning of David's double life back, not to 2012, when he married Marie, but to some point before 2003, before Angela, before the first documented legal marriage. Investigators who revisited the financial and phone records after Angela came forward found evidence suggesting that David had been managing some version of a parallel domestic arrangement for most of his adult life, that the system Claire had described to Sandra, the phones, the schedule, the garage, the overlapping geography, had not been invented for Maple Creek Drive. It had been refined there. What Claire and Marie had experienced was not the beginning of something. It was the fully developed form of something that had been built over 2 decades, tested across at least one prior marriage, and brought to what David had apparently believed was its most sustainable and least detectable configuration. The investigators found this harder to process than almost anything else in the case. Not the bigamy itself, not the scale of the financial deception, but the patience. The extraordinary, sustained, almost incomprehensible patience it required to live this way across 2 decades, and the question of what it costs a person, internally, to maintain that kind of discipline for that long, and what is left of them by the time it ends. Sandra Voss was approached by multiple podcast producers and documentary filmmakers after the story became public. She declined every single one of them. She gave one brief statement to a Columbus reporter. It read, in its entirety, "The women told their story. That is enough." Most people who heard that felt she was right. Claire settled in Asheville and remarried in the spring of 2025. She does not speak publicly about David Mercer. She runs a private online community for women rebuilding their lives after long-term relational betrayal, and the only sentence she has ever shared publicly about her own experience reads, "I do not write about him anymore. I write about after him." The friends who have seen her in the years since Maple Creek Drive describe a woman who is genuinely, substantively happy, not in the fragile way of someone who has decided to perform recovery, but in the grounded and clear-eyed way of someone who went through something that could have broken them and decided, at some specific and private moment, that it was not going to. Marie stayed in the house on Maple Creek Drive. Her daughter Lily is now 12. Marie said in the one interview she gave to a women's magazine in late 2023 that she stayed because Lily grew up in that house, because her daughter had friends on that street, and a bedroom she had painted herself, and a backyard she knew every corner of, and because she had decided she was not going to be the one to uproot a child's entire world over something a man had done. She works now as a volunteer victim advocate with a Columbus nonprofit that supports women navigating domestic legal proceedings. She started, she said, because she kept thinking about the moment Claire knocked on the back gate, and what it would have meant to her to have had someone on the other side of it who already understood what she was about to learn. David Mercer completed his probation in 2025. He lives alone. His heart condition, according to the last available reporting, is being managed with medication. No one on Maple Creek Drive speaks about him. His name surfaces occasionally in comment sections and online forums where people discuss the case, usually in the context of a question that has no clean resolution. Some people say they feel something adjacent to pity for him, That the architecture of fear he spent a lifetime constructing around himself was its own kind of prison, that whatever drove him to build two lives instead of fully inhabiting one was deep and old and probably, at the end of all of it, as lonely as anything can be. Most people do not feel pity. Most people feel something simpler and less troubled, the ordinary moral clarity that most of us are fortunate enough to be able to rely on when we hear a story like this. The clear and uncomplicated knowledge that what was done here was wrong, that it was sustained across 20 years, and that the two women who paid the price for it deserved a great deal better than a wooden fence and a man who parked in the garage. Here is what this story does that most stories about betrayal do not. It does not give you a villain who looks like a villain. It does not give you a man who is obviously dangerous or obviously unstable or obviously carrying something that any attentive person should have caught. It gives you a man who built a cedar-raised bed for his wife's tomato garden because she mentioned once that she had always wanted one. A man who cried during his wedding vows. A man who coached Little League and shoveled his elderly neighbor's walk without being asked. And it asks you to sit with the uncomfortable truth that the gap between who David Mercer appeared to be and who David Mercer actually was is not a gap that most of us, if we are honest, are equipped to see, not because we are foolish or inattentive, but because the gap was maintained by someone who understood, with precision and with practice, exactly where the edges of human attention sit, and who had spent 20 years placing himself just inside them. There is something that people who study sustained deception at a clinical level have said about cases like this, not about this case specifically, but about the pattern it represents. They say that the most durable deceptions are not maintained by dishonesty alone. They are maintained by the fact that the person doing the deceiving provides something real, something the person being deceived correctly identifies as genuine, and which therefore becomes the foundation on which all the constructed things rest. Claire correctly identified that David listened to her, that he was present, that he paid attention. Those things were real. Marie correctly identified that David showed up, that he was a present father, that he was steady and reliable. Those things were real too. The deception was not that he pretended to be something he was not entirely. The deception was that he divided what was genuine about himself between two women and gave neither of them the complete picture, and neither of them, operating on the information they had access to, had any reason to ask for the parts of the picture they could not see. That is what makes a story like this so difficult to fully resolve. Not the legal charges, not the sentence, not even the question of where everyone is now. It is the quieter and more personal question that anyone who has ever trusted another person completely has to briefly sit with after hearing it. How much of what we know about the people closest to us is what they have chosen to show us? And how much of what they have chosen not to show us are we simply, quietly, not looking at? Before we close out, we want to ask you something directly. If you had been living on that street, if you had waved to David Mercer on Saturday mornings and borrowed his jumper cables in January, and watched him coach third base at the Little League field, do you honestly think you would have seen it? Not with the benefit of everything you now know, but at the time, with only what the street could see. Drop your answer in the comments right now, and tell us at what point in this story something shifted for you. Was it the garage? Was it the casserole? Was it the moment Claire stood at the mailbox counting 60 seconds? Tell us, because this community has some of the most thoughtful and perceptive responses we have read anywhere. And this story deserves that kind of conversation. And if you have not already subscribed, please do that now, because the next story we are bringing you involves a family in Western Pennsylvania, a man the entire community believed was a decorated war veteran, a stranger who showed up at a funeral with information that turned grief into a criminal investigation, and an ending that a novelist would have been told was too convenient to publish. But it happened. It is documented. And we will take you through every detail of it the same way we took you through this one, from the very beginning, all the way to the end, without flinching. Thank you for watching this all the way through. Stories like this one deserve to be heard completely, and you stayed.